The moving truck pulled away from 1247 Maple Grove Drive just as the first October leaves began their descent, each one catching the afternoon light like tiny flames against the pewter sky. Sarah Martinez stood on the sidewalk, her designer heels clicking against the concrete as she adjusted the collar of her charcoal wool coat. At 32, she had learned to carry herself with a kind of quiet confidence that came from building an empire from nothing. But today, something different flickered in her dark eyes. A mixture of triumph and old wounds finally finding their voice. The house she'd just purchased for $2 million in cash sat like a silent sentinel next to her childhood home. Its Victorian architecture a mirror image of the place where she'd spent 18 years feeling invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same parents who had given away her bedroom to her younger brother without so much as a conversation were now her next-door neighbors, whether they liked it or not. Sarah's phone buzzed against her palm, pulling her from the moment. "Martinez Tech Solutions, this is Sarah," she answered, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism that had helped her build a $40 million software company before her 30th birthday. "Boss, the contractors just confirmed they can start the home office renovation tomorrow," came the familiar voice of Marcus Chen, her business partner and the closest thing she had to family these days. "You sure about this whole moving next door to your parents thing? Seems like you're asking for drama." Sarah's gaze drifted to the window of what used to be her bedroom, now adorned with gaming posters and neon lights that cast an artificial blue glow even in daylight. "Sometimes drama finds you whether you ask for it or not, Marcus. Besides, it's a good investment. Property values in Riverside Heights have increased 30% in the last 5 years. Right, because Sarah Martinez, tech mogul, definitely needs to worry about property appreciation," Marcus chuckled. "Just promise me you're not doing this to prove a point." The question hung in the air like morning mist, and Sarah found herself unable to answer immediately. Through the sheer curtains of the house next door, she caught a glimpse of movement. Her mother, Elena Martinez, pausing at the kitchen window with a coffee mug in her hands. Even from a distance, Sarah could read the shock in her mother's posture, the way her shoulders tensed when she realized who was standing on the neighboring property. "I have to go," Sarah said, ending the call before Marcus could respond. She slipped the phone into her purse, a custom leather piece that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and walked toward the wrought iron gate that separated the two properties. Her footsteps echoed with a rhythm that spoke of purpose and barely contained emotion. The gate's latch felt cold beneath her fingers, a sensation that transported her back 20 years to when she was 12 and had spent countless afternoons sitting on this very fence, watching the world go by while her parents fussed over her younger brother Jake's latest achievement. Back then, the metal had been painted a cheerful blue, and Sarah wore hand-me-downs from cousins who lived 3 states away. Now the gate was black, sophisticated, and Sarah wore clothes that bore her own initials embroidered in silk thread. As she approached the front door of her childhood home, memories cascaded through her mind like water through a broken dam. She remembered the day she'd graduated summa cum laude from MIT, calling home with tears of joy streaming down her face, only to have the conversation cut short because Jake had scored a goal in his high school soccer match. She remembered the Christmas morning when she was 16, watching her parents beam with pride as Jake unwrapped the latest gaming console, while her own gift, a gift card to the local bookstore, sat forgotten beneath layers of discarded wrapping paper. But mostly, she remembered the day 6 months ago that she called to tell them that she was coming home for her birthday, only to be told that her room was no longer available. "Jake's been living there for 2 years now, mija," her father had said in that careful tone people use when they're trying to minimize hurt feelings. "He's got all his streaming equipment set up. You understand, right? You can stay in the guest room." The guest room. As if she were a visitor in the house where she'd grown up, where she dreamed her first dreams and nursed her first heartbreaks. As if 18 years of memories could be erased with a simple room reassignment and the assumption that she'd understand. Sarah's finger hovered over the doorbell. The same brass button she'd pressed 1,000 times as a child, usually because she'd forgotten her key or because her arms were too full of library books to fish through her backpack. The button looked smaller now,
Or maybe her hands had simply grown larger. She pressed it once, a sharp, decisive sound that seemed to reverberate through the quiet afternoon. Footsteps approached from inside, and Sarah straightened her spine, calling upon the same composure that had helped her negotiate million-dollar contracts with Fortune 500 companies. The door opened, and Elena Martinez stood framed in the doorway, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in the same loose bun she'd worn for as long as Sarah could remember. Her mother's eyes, the same dark brown that Sarah had inherited, widened with a complex mixture of surprise, confusion, and something that might have been guilt. "Sarah, what are you doing here, and why is there a moving truck?" Elena's words trailed off as the pieces clicked into place. Her gaze shifted from her daughter to the house next door, then back again. "No, you didn't." "I did." Sarah's voice was steady, controlled, but beneath the surface lay years of accumulated disappointment and the fierce satisfaction of a checkmate move. "Hello, Mom. I'm your new neighbor." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken history, with all the words that had been swallowed over the years in the name of keeping peace. Elena's hand gripped the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles went white. And Sarah noticed for the first time how much her mother had aged. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during their last video call, and her hands bore the subtle tremor of stress, or perhaps the beginning of something more concerning. "You bought the Henderson house?" Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. "For $2 million. Cash." Sarah delivered the information with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. She watched her mother process the implications, that her eldest daughter, the one they'd somehow forgotten to make room for, had the kind of money that most people only dreamed about, that she'd chosen to spend it on proximity to the family that made her feel like an afterthought. From somewhere inside the house came the sound of footsteps on stairs, and Sarah knew without looking that Jake was descending from what used to be her bedroom. Her younger brother appeared behind their mother, his hair tousled from what Sarah assumed was an afternoon of streaming video games to his modest but dedicated online following. At 28, Jake had the kind of perpetual adolescence that their parents had always found charming, but that Sarah now recognized as a symptom of never having been required to truly grow up. "Sarah!" Jake's voice carried genuine surprise, and perhaps a flicker of the guilt that Sarah had been hoping to see. "Mom said you were too busy with work to visit." The statement landed like a physical blow, and Sarah felt the familiar sting of having her absence misrepresented. She'd offered to visit a dozen times in the past year, but there had always been something. Jake's tournament, her parents' cruise, a family friend's wedding, to which she mysteriously hadn't been invited. "I was too busy to stay in a hotel," Sarah replied, her tone deliberately light. "So I bought the house next door instead. Much more convenient." Jake's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. "You bought a house? Like with a mortgage?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. So perfectly did it capture her family's fundamental misunderstanding of her success. To them, she was still the bookish girl who'd spent more money on college applications than most people spent on vacations. Still the daughter who'd paid her own way through MIT while Jake's college expenses had been handled without question. "No mortgage," she said simply. "I paid in cash." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying with them the weight of years of careful investment, ruthless business decisions, and the kind of success that her family had never quite believed possible for their eldest daughter. Sarah watched as the reality settled over them, that she wasn't just successful, she was wealthy in a way that fundamentally changed the power dynamics of every interaction. Elena stepped back, inadvertently creating space for Sarah to enter, but Sarah remained on the threshold. This was her childhood home, but it no longer felt like a place where she belonged. The walls were the same pale yellow they'd always been, and the family photos still lined the hallway in their mismatched frames, But something essential had shifted. Or perhaps it had been missing all along and Sarah was only now allowing herself to see it clearly. "How long are you planning to stay?" Elena asked, and Sarah could hear the careful calculation in the question. How long would they need to navigate this new reality? How long before things could go back to the comfortable distance that had defined their relationship for the past decade? "I'm not staying," Sarah replied, savoring the moment of confusion that flickered across her mother's face. "I'm living. There's a difference." As if summoned by the tension in the air, Sarah's father, Roberto Martinez, appeared from the depths of the house. He was smaller than Sarah remembered, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of working as a machinist, but his eyes were still sharp and assessing. He took in the scene with the methodical care of a man accustomed to understanding how things worked, and Sarah could practically see him trying to piece together the mechanics of his daughter's sudden appearance. "Sarah bought the Henderson house," Elena said, her voice hollow with shock that hadn't yet transformed into acceptance. Roberto's eyebrows rose, disappearing beneath the gray fringe of his hairline. "Bought it? As in to live in? As in to own it?" Sarah's voice carried a note of steel that she'd perfected in boardrooms filled with men who tried to diminish her. "I thought it was time to come home." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they weren't entirely true. This wasn't about coming home. It was about redefining what home meant on her own terms. It was about refusing to accept the narrative that had been written for her, the story in which she was successful but distant, accomplished but somehow less central to the family than the son who had never moved more than 20 miles from his childhood bedroom. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the front porch where Sarah had once sat doing homework while Jake played in the backyard. The shadows seemed to stretch between them now, marking the distance that had grown over years of phone calls that ended too quickly and visits that never happened. But for the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. "We should talk," Roberto said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd realized that his understanding of his daughter might need significant revision. "Yes," Sarah agreed, but she made no move to enter the house. Instead, she gestured toward the property next door, where the setting sun was beginning to illuminate the windows of her new home. "But not today. Today, I need to settle in. Tomorrow, we can talk about how things are going to be different." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete with the same rhythm that had announced her arrival. But this time, the sound carried a different message, not the tentative step of someone seeking permission to belong, but the confident stride of someone who had claimed her place in the world and was prepared to defend it. As Sarah reached the gate that separated the properties, she heard the front door of her childhood home close with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the gathering twilight, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of something entirely new. She paused, with her hand on the latch, looking up at the bedroom window where she'd once dreamed of a future that had seemed impossibly distant. The neon lights were still glowing, casting their artificial blue radiance into the dusk, but they no longer seemed like a symbol of displacement. They were simply lights in a window, and Sarah Martinez had her own house now, with her own windows and her own dreams taking shape behind them. The question that hung in the autumn air wasn't what she lost by leaving this place. It was what she might finally be able to build by choosing to return. Sarah stood in the master bedroom of her new house, surrounded by boxes labeled with her assistant's precise handwriting. Office files, urgent. Personal items, fragile. And kitchen, essentials only. The room was larger than her first apartment had been, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of her childhood home next door. She'd specifically requested that the movers position her bed so she could see that blue-lit window every morning when she woke up, a daily reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her as she unpacked a framed photograph of herself shaking hands with the governor at a technology summit last year. Here she was, a woman who had built a company that employed over 300 people, whose software solutions had revolutionized how small businesses managed their operations, and whose personal net worth exceeded what most families earned in several lifetimes.
Yet she'd just spent $2 million to live next door to parents who had never quite figured out how to see her as anything more than their responsible but somehow less important child. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Contractors arrive at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Also, your mom called the office looking for you. Should I be worried?" Sarah set the phone aside without responding and continued unpacking. Each item told a story of the life she'd built far from Maple Grove Drive: the Crystal Award from the Women in Technology Foundation, the leather portfolio from her first $1 million contract, the silk scarf she'd bought herself in Paris during a business trip that had turned into the first real vacation she'd taken in years. These were the artifacts of success, the tangible proof that the bookish girl who'd once been told she was too serious and too focused on school had been exactly serious and focused enough. But tonight, surrounded by the trappings of her accomplished life, Sarah found herself thinking about the girl she'd been before success had armed her with confidence. She remembered the way she'd felt at 14 when her parents had missed her debate team's state championship because Jake had a regional soccer tournament the same weekend. They'd promised to stream the debate online, but Jake's team had gone to dinner afterward to celebrate, and by the time they'd returned to the hotel, Sarah's event was over. She'd won that debate, arguing passionately about the importance of investing in renewable energy infrastructure, and she'd called home from the school bus during the 3-hour ride back to tell someone, anyone, who might be proud of her achievement. The call had gone to voicemail. When her parents finally called back 2 days later, they'd congratulated her warmly, but the moment had passed. The joy had curdled into something harder to digest. Sarah opened a box labeled Books, Personal Collection, and began arranging volumes on the built-in shelves that lined one wall of the bedroom. Her fingers lingered on a worn copy of Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, the margins filled with notes she'd made during her first year as an entrepreneur. Next to it, she placed her college copy of The Art of Computer Programming, its pages dog-eared and highlighted in multiple colors. These books had been her companions during the lonely hours when she'd been building her company, when the weight of every decision had rested solely on her shoulders. The sound of laughter drifted through the windows, and Sarah glanced outside to see her parents and Jake gathered around their kitchen table, visible through the gauzy curtains that Elena had never quite been able to coordinate properly. The scene looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting: 3 people sharing a meal, heads bent together in conversation, the warm glow of overhead lighting casting everything in amber tones. For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar pang of exclusion, the sense that there was a version of family happiness happening just 20 feet away that she was somehow not qualified to join. But then she reminded herself that she'd been invited to participate in that tableau for years, and the invitations had always come with conditions. She could join them if she was willing to be smaller, quieter, less complicated. If she was willing to pretend that her successes were somehow accidental, rather than the result of 18-hour days and the kind of strategic thinking that had allowed her to anticipate market needs before her competitors even recognized they existed. Her laptop chimed with an incoming video call, and Sarah's mood lifted when she saw Priya Patel's name on the screen. Priya was her best friend from MIT, now a successful surgeon in Seattle, and one of the few people who truly understood the complexities of being a woman who'd achieved significant success in a field dominated by men. "Please tell me you didn't actually buy a house next door to your parents out of spite," Priya said without preamble, her dark eyes twinkling with amusement from the screen. "I bought a house next door to my parents because it was a good investment. The spite is just the bonus." Priya laughed, the sound rich and knowing. "Right, because Sarah Martinez, the woman who researches restaurant reviews for 20 minutes before ordering takeout, definitely made a $2 million impulse purchase." "It wasn't impulse," she protested, but she was smiling now, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I've been thinking about this for months, ever since the birthday visit that didn't happen." "Ah, yes, the great bedroom reassignment scandal," Priya said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "You know I love you, but are you sure you're not setting yourself up for more heartache? Living next door to people who've hurt you isn't going to magically fix your relationship with them." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching her family through the window. Jake was gesturing animatedly, probably telling a story about his latest streaming adventure, while Roberto and Elena listened with the kind of rapt attention they'd always given their youngest child.
It was a scene she'd witnessed countless times throughout her childhood and adolescence, usually from the periphery, usually doing homework or helping with dinner preparation. "I'm not trying to fix anything," Sarah said finally. "I'm trying to stop running from it. Do you know that in the past 10 years, I've only spent a total of maybe 30 days in the same city as my parents? I've been to Singapore more often than I've been home for Sunday dinner." "Because Sunday dinners were painful," Priya pointed gently. "Because you always left feeling worse about yourself than when you arrived." "Exactly. And I got tired of feeling like the problem was me." Sarah's voice took on an edge that Priya recognized as the tone she used in business negotiations. "So I decided to change the dynamic. They can't dismiss me as the absent daughter anymore when I'm literally living next door. They can't pretend my success is theoretical when it's sitting right there in a $2 million house." Priya studied her friend's face through the screen, recognizing the stubborn set of Sarah's jaw that had appeared during their most challenging MIT problem sets. "And if they still don't get it, if proximity doesn't equal understanding, then at least I'll know I tried," Sarah's voice softened. "And I'll have a beautiful house in a neighborhood I love, close enough to my company's satellite office to make the commute reasonable. It's not like I'm sacrificing anything important."
But even as she said it, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. She was sacrificing the comfortable distance that had protected her from her family's casual indifference. She was giving up the narrative that had sustained her through years of building her company. The story that she was too busy and too important to worry about family dynamics. By moving next door, she was forcing herself to confront the possibility that no amount of success would ever be enough to earn the kind of unconditional love and attention her parents had always lavished on Jake. After ending the call with Priya, Sarah continued unpacking, each item a meditation on the life she'd built and the life she'd left behind. She found herself thinking about the patterns that had shaped her childhood, the way she learned to excel academically because good grades were the one thing that consistently earned her parents' approval, the way she'd become comfortable with solitude because Jake's social calendar had always taken precedence over hers, the way she developed an almost obsessive drive to succeed because success was the only currency that seemed to matter in her family. She remembered the day she'd received her acceptance letter to MIT, how she'd run downstairs to share the news, only to find her parents helping Jake with his algebra homework. They'd looked up when she burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement, and Elena had smiled distractedly. "That's wonderful, Mija, but can it wait? Jake has a test tomorrow, and you know how much trouble he has with math." Sarah had stood in the doorway, holding her acceptance letter, watching her parents pour their attention into helping Jake understand concepts that she'd mastered years earlier. The moment had crystallized something for her. The understanding that her achievements, no matter how significant, would always be secondary to Jake's immediate needs. She'd gone to her room that night and started researching scholarships with a systematic determination that her parents had assumed was just another example of her being naturally responsible. They'd never understood that her responsibility was learned, not natural, that she'd become self-sufficient because the alternative was being forgotten. They'd praised her independence without recognizing that it had grown from a soil of benign neglect, watered by years of having her accomplishments overshadowed by her brother's struggles. Now, at 32, Sarah had built a life that insulated her from that kind of casual dismissal. Her employees looked to her for leadership, her clients valued her expertise, and her business partners respected her judgment. She'd created a world where her worth was measured by concrete achievements rather than her ability to be convenient and undemanding. But the girl who'd once sat in her bedroom doing calculus homework while her parents celebrated Jake's B+ in English still lived somewhere inside her. And that girl had questions that success couldn't answer. Questions like, what would it feel like to be the child your parents bragged about to their friends? What would it be like to call home with good news and have that news be the most important thing happening in their day? What would it mean to be seen not just as successful, but as essential? As Sarah arranged her clothes in the walk-in closet that was larger than the bedroom she'd grown up in, she found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment.
Every decision to work late instead of attending family gatherings, every promotion that had taken her further from home, every relationship that had ended because she couldn't make time for someone else's needs, all of it had been in service of becoming the kind of person who couldn't be overlooked or dismissed. The strategy had worked, perhaps too well. She'd become so successful that her family seemed to view her as existing in a different universe entirely, one where normal rules of affection and attention didn't apply. They were proud of her, certainly, but in the abstract way that people are proud of celebrities or distant relatives who've achieved something notable. The pride came without intimacy, without the messy complexity of actual relationship. Tomorrow, she would wake up in her new house and begin the process of forcing those worlds to collide. She would be successful Sarah and daughter Sarah in the same physical space, and her family would have to reckon with the reality that they'd created both versions of her, the accomplished woman who'd learned to find validation in her work, and the child who'd never stopped hoping that someday her achievements might be enough to earn the kind of unconditional love and attention her parents had always lavished on Jake.
The last item Sarah unpacked that night was a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, Abuela Carmen, who had died when Sarah was 16. Inside the box were letters that Carmen had written to Sarah during her freshman year of college. Letters filled with encouragement, pride, and the kind of detailed questions about Sarah's studies that her parents had never thought to ask. Carmen had been the one person in Sarah's family who had understood her drive, who had seen her ambition as something beautiful rather than something that needed to be managed or contained. Sarah held one of the letters up to the light, reading her grandmother's careful handwriting. "Mija, your mother called to tell me about your physics award. She said it like she was surprised, but I wasn't surprised at all. I've been watching you since you were little, and I always knew you were going to do something important with your mind. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force, and she realized that Carmen had seen what her parents had missed, that Sarah's achievements weren't accidents or strokes of luck, but the natural result of a brilliant mind coupled with relentless determination. Carmen had understood that Sarah's success was intrinsic to who she was, not something that happened despite her personality, but because of it. As Sarah prepared for bed in her new house, she could see the blue glow from Jake's room casting shadows on the wall they now shared. Tomorrow, she would begin the complex work of being neighbors with the people who had raised her, loved her imperfectly, and somehow never quite figured out how to see her clearly. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Not running from her history, but finally ready to face it on her own terms. The first confrontation came at 7:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, before Sarah had even finished her first cup of coffee. She was standing in her kitchen, reviewing architectural plans for the home office renovation, when she heard the unmistakable sound of her mother's voice rising in agitation from the backyard next door. "Roberto, you need to talk to her. This is completely inappropriate." Sarah moved to the window above her sink, the same window that provided a perfect view of her parents' back patio. Elena was standing with her arms crossed, gesturing towards Sarah's house with the kind of emphatic movements that Sarah remembered from childhood arguments about curfews and college choices. "What's inappropriate about buying a house?" Roberto's voice was calmer, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "She's a successful businesswoman. She can live wherever she wants." "Don't be naive." Elena's tone carried the sharp edge of frustration. "She didn't buy this house because she fell in love with the neighborhood. She bought it to make a point, and you know it." Sarah set down her coffee mug with deliberate care, recognizing the familiar pattern. Her mother was discussing her as if she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person who'd made an autonomous decision. It was the same tone Elena had used when Sarah was 18 and had announced her intention to major in computer science instead of education. "She's just being stubborn," Elena had told Roberto then. "She'll come around when she realizes how hard it's going to be." The sound of a truck engine interrupted Sarah's eavesdropping, and she watched through her front windows as the construction crew arrived for the office renovation. Marcus had hired the best firm in the city, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she saw the workers unloading high-end materials and professional equipment. If her parents wanted to discuss her motivations, they'd have plenty to observe over the next few weeks. By 8:30 a.m., the sounds of construction were echoing through both houses, and Sarah was dressed for her video conference with the board of directors. She'd deliberately chosen her most expensive suit, a charcoal gray piece from a designer whose name her mother would recognize from magazine covers, and positioned herself in front of the window that faced her childhood home. If Elena happened to look outside during the meeting, she'd see her daughter commanding the attention of some of the most powerful business leaders in the region. The meeting went smoothly, with Sarah presenting quarterly projections that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Her company's latest software suite was being adopted by businesses across 3 states, and the licensing deals they'd secured were generating passive income that would fund expansion for years to come. As Sarah fielded questions from board members who treated her expertise with the deference it deserved, she caught glimpses of her mother moving around in the kitchen next door, occasionally pausing to peer through the curtains.
After the meeting ended, Sarah had barely closed her laptop when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her Aunt Rosa, Elena's younger sister, who lived in Phoenix and had always served as the family's unofficial mediator. "Sarah, honey, your mother called me at 6 in the morning," Rosa said without preamble. "She's having some kind of crisis about you buying the Henderson house. Please tell me you didn't do this to spite them." Sarah walked out onto her back deck, noting that the construction noise seemed to have drawn Jake to his bedroom window. Her brother was peering through the blinds with the kind of curiosity that suggested he was finally grasping the magnitude of what Sarah had done. "I bought a house because I wanted to own property in my hometown," Sarah said, settling into one of the teak chairs she'd had delivered yesterday. "Why is that so hard for everyone to understand?" "Because normal people don't buy $2 million houses next door to their parents unless they're trying to prove something," Rosa replied, but her tone was more amused than critical. "Though I have to say, I'm impressed. I always knew you were going to be successful, but this is next-level successful." "Thank you for noticing," and she meant it. Rosa had been one of the few family members who'd consistently acknowledged Sarah's achievements over the years. "So what's the plan here, mija? Are you going to make them suffer through awkward neighborly interactions until they apologize for every slight from your childhood?" The question was pointed enough to make Sarah pause. Was that what she was doing? Creating a situation where her family would be forced to confront their own behavior? "I'm not trying to make anyone suffer," Sarah said finally, "but I'm also not going to pretend anymore that their treatment of me has been acceptable. Maybe proximity will help them see things differently." "And if it doesn't?" Sarah watched as Elena appeared in the backyard, hanging laundry on the line she'd insisted on keeping, despite Roberto's offers to buy her a modern dryer. Her mother moved with the efficient motions of someone who'd performed the same task thousands of times, but there was tension in her shoulders that Sarah had learned to recognize as a sign of emotional distress. "Then at least I'll have clarity," Sarah said. That afternoon, the first direct confrontation arrived in the form of Elena appearing at Sarah's front door carrying a casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of a woman who decided to take matters into her own hands. "We need to talk," Elena announced when Sarah opened the door. "Hello to you too, Mom." Sarah stepped aside to let her mother enter, noting how Elena's eyes immediately began cataloging the expensive furnishings and architectural details. The house had been professionally decorated in a modern style that emphasized clean lines and natural materials, and Sarah knew her mother was calculating the cost of everything she saw. "This is beautiful," Elena said, her tone carefully neutral. "Very sophisticated." They sat in Sarah's living room, the casserole dish balanced on Elena's lap like a peace offering that she wasn't quite ready to surrender. Through the windows, Sarah could see the construction crew taking a lunch break, their presence a reminder of the changes that were literally reshaping the landscape of her childhood neighborhood. "I brought you some of my chicken enchiladas," Elena said, finally placing the dish on the coffee table between them. "I thought, well,
I thought you might be eating too much takeout while you're getting settled. It was such a perfectly Elena gesture, an attempt to express care through food, while simultaneously implying that Sarah was somehow not taking proper care of herself. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of affection and frustration that had characterized her relationship with her mother for as long as she could remember. "Thank you," Sarah said. "That was thoughtful."
They sat in silence for a moment, and Sarah could practically see her mother formulating the conversation she'd come to have. Elena had never been comfortable with direct confrontation, preferring to approach difficult topics through a series of carefully constructed leading questions. "Sarah, I need to understand what you're doing here," Elena said finally. "This house, the construction, living next door to us, what are you trying to accomplish?" "I'm trying to have a relationship with my family," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm making it impossible for you to forget that I exist." Elena's face flushed. "We never forgot you exist. You're our daughter. We love you." "Do you?" The question emerged before Sarah could stop herself, carrying with it years of accumulated hurt. Because loving someone and treating them as if they matter are two different things, Mom. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Sarah leaned forward, her composure finally cracking. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed something, not because you had news about Jake, but because you were thinking about your oldest daughter and wondered how her day was going." Elena opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Sarah watched her mother's face as she searched through her memories, and the silence that stretched between them was more damning than any accusation could have been. "I call you," Elena said weakly. "You call me on my birthday and Christmas. You call me when Jake needs career advice because he knows I'll actually help him. You called me when you needed recommendations for Dad's retirement investment portfolio." Sarah's voice was gaining strength, years of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. "But when was the last time you called because you missed me?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but Sarah couldn't tell if they were tears of guilt or self-pity. "You're always so busy, Sarah. You have this important job and this important life, and we didn't want to bother you with our little problems." "My job is important. My life is important. But that doesn't mean I don't want to be part of this family." Sarah gestured toward the window that faced her childhood home. "Do you know why I work so hard, Mom? Do you know why I built a company that requires my attention 18 hours a day?" Elena shook her head, looking genuinely confused. "Because work was the only place where my accomplishments mattered, where people noticed when I did something exceptional, where my success was celebrated instead of being treated like an inconvenience." "We're proud of you," Elena protested. "We've always been proud of you." "You're proud of the idea of me," Sarah corrected. "You love telling your friends that your daughter runs a successful company, but you've never asked me what my company actually does. You've never asked about the challenges I face or the problems I'm trying to solve. You know I'm successful, but you don't know who I am." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded Sarah painfully of her childhood. "I don't understand technology, Mija. I wouldn't know what questions to ask." "You could ask about my life outside of work. You could ask if I'm dating anyone, if I'm happy, if I ever get lonely running a company. You could ask about my hobbies or my friends or what I do for fun." Sarah's voice softened slightly. "You could ask me the same kinds of questions you ask Jake every time he calls." The comparison hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched as understanding began to dawn in her mother's eyes. Elena had always maintained detailed knowledge of Jake's social life, his streaming schedule, his financial struggles, his dating disasters. She could recite the names of his online friends and describe the plot lines of the games he played for his audience. But she couldn't name a single one of Sarah's employees or describe what her daughter's daily routine looked like. "It's different with Jake," Elena said quietly. "He needs more support." "Does he? Or have you just convinced yourself that he does because it's easier than admitting that you've always favored him?" The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Elena recoiled as if Sarah had slapped her. I don't favor Jake. I love both of my children equally. Love and attention aren't the same thing, Mom. You can love me and still consistently choose to prioritize his needs over mine. You can love me and still give away my bedroom without asking how I'd feel about it. Elena's face crumpled. That room. Jake had been living there for 2 years. It seemed practical. It seemed practical to give away the only space in this house that ever felt like mine without even having a conversation about it. Sarah stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard, where she'd spent countless afternoons reading while Jake played with friends. Do you know what that felt like? To call home and be told that my childhood bedroom was no longer available to me because it was more convenient for Jake to live there? We thought you understood. I understood perfectly. I understood that in your mind, I'm the child who doesn't need anything because I figured out how to take care of myself. I'm the daughter who can be treated as an afterthought because I won't make a scene or create drama. Well, here's your drama, Mom. $2 million worth of drama, sitting right next door where you can't ignore it. Elena was crying openly now, but Sarah felt no satisfaction in her mother's tears. This wasn't the vindication she'd hoped for. It was just painful, like lancing an infected wound. I don't know how to fix this, Elena whispered. I don't know if you can, Sarah replied honestly. But living next door means we're going to have to figure out how to exist in the same space without pretending that everything is fine. After Elena left, taking her casserole dish and her tears with her, Sarah sat alone in her living room, listening to the sounds of construction from upstairs. The workers were installing built-in shelving and what would become her home office, creating a space where she could run her company from the house next door to the people who had never quite understood what she had accomplished. That evening, Jake appeared at her door. Unlike Elena's visit, which had been announced and purposeful, Jake's arrival felt hesitant, almost apologetic. He stood on her doorstep wearing the same kind of graphic t-shirt he'd favored since high school, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Mom's been crying all afternoon," he said without preamble. "I imagine she has been." Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he moved through her house with the careful attention of someone cataloging unfamiliar wealth. "This place is incredible," Jake said, his voice carrying genuine awe. "I mean, I knew you were doing well, but this is like movie star rich." Sarah almost laughed at the comparison. "It's business owner rich. There's a difference."
They settled in the kitchen, where Sarah poured 2 glasses of wine that cost more than Jake typically spent on groceries in a week. She watched her brother process the reality of her success. The imported tile, the professional-grade appliances, the custom cabinetry that had been installed by craftsmen who'd worked on celebrity homes. "I need to ask you something," Jake said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Did I really take your room, or was Mom just being dramatic?" The question was so perfectly Jake, earnest, self-centered, and completely lacking in self-awareness, that Sarah had to take a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't destroy what little relationship they had left. "You moved into my room 2 years ago when I was living in San Francisco," Sarah said carefully. "Mom and Dad decided it made sense because you needed space for your streaming setup, and I was only visiting a few times a year. But you were okay with it, right? I mean, you never said anything." Sarah studied her brother's face, looking for signs that he understood the implications of what he was asking. Jake had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain oblivious to the impact of his actions on others, and she could see that this conversation was no different. "I wasn't asked if I was okay with it. I was told about it after the fact, during a phone call where I was trying to arrange a visit home." Jake's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of discomfort flickering across his features. "Oh, I didn't know that." "Of course you didn't, because no one thought to consider how I might feel about it." They sat in silence for a moment, and Sarah could practically see Jake trying to reconcile his understanding of their family dynamics with the picture she was painting. In Jake's version of their childhood, he was the struggling younger brother who needed extra support, while Sarah was the naturally gifted older sister who succeeded at everything without effort. The idea that her success might have come at an emotional cost had never occurred to him.
I always thought you were the lucky one. You were smart and responsible, and Mom and Dad never had to worry about you. They were always on my case about something, grades, friends, money. I thought you had it easy." Sarah felt a surge of sympathy for her brother, recognizing for the first time that their parents' different treatment had been damaging to both of them, just in different ways. Jake had grown up believing that love came through attention and intervention, while Sarah had learned that love was something you earned through achievement and self-sufficiency. "I was responsible because I had to be," Sarah said gently. "And Mom and Dad didn't worry about me because I learned very early that my problems were less important than yours." Jake winced. "That's not how I saw it." "I know, but that's how it felt from my perspective." They talked for another hour, and Sarah found herself sharing stories from their childhood that she'd never told anyone. Moments when she'd felt invisible, occasions when her accomplishments had been overshadowed by Jake's immediate needs, the gradual process by which he'd learned to find validation outside of their family. Jake, for his part, seemed genuinely shocked by these revelations. He'd grown up in the same house, but his experience had been fundamentally different. Where Sarah had seen favoritism, Jake had seen appropriate support. Where Sarah had felt overlooked, Jake had felt appropriately independent. "I don't know what to do with this information," Jake said as he prepared to leave. "I mean, I can't undo the past 28 years.
The distinction felt important. As a daughter, she'd been subject to her family's expectations and patterns. As a neighbor, she had boundaries, choices, and the power to determine the terms of engagement. The $2 million house wasn't just real estate. It was autonomy made manifest, a physical declaration that she could love her family without being diminished by them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth or conflict, but tonight, Sarah fell asleep in her own house, surrounded by the evidence of her success, listening to the sounds of the family she was determined to love differently. Sunday dinner at the Martinez house felt like entering a museum exhibit of Sarah's childhood, except now she was observing it from the outside, with the perspective that $28 million in net worth and 14 years of therapy could provide. She stood on the front porch, holding a bottle of wine that cost more than her parents typically spent on groceries in a month, listening to the familiar sounds of her mother's pre-dinner anxiety echoing through the screen door. "Roberto, did you remember to fix the wobbly chair? Sarah's going to think we can afford to maintain our own furniture." Elena's voice carried the particular pitch of stress that Sarah remembered from childhood dinner parties and school events. "Elena, she knows we're not millionaires," Roberto replied, his tone carrying the patience of a man who'd had this conversation many times. "She grew up here. She knows exactly how much money we have." Sarah knocked on the door before her mother could spiral further into worry about appearances. When Elena answered, Sarah was struck by how much effort her mother had put into the evening. She was wearing the navy dress she usually reserved for church, and the dining room table was set with the good china that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. "You look beautiful, Mom," Sarah said, meaning it. Elena had always been an attractive woman, but the stress of the past week had etched new lines around her eyes. "Thank you, mija. Come in, come in. I hope you're hungry." The house smelled exactly as Sarah remembered, a combination of Elena's cooking, Roberto's coffee, and the faint scent of the vanilla candles her mother burned obsessively. But walking through the familiar rooms felt surreal now that Sarah had her own house next door. She was simultaneously home and visiting, family and guest. Jake emerged from the kitchen carrying a beer and wearing what Sarah suspected was his cleanest t-shirt. "Hey, Sarah, thanks for coming over." The formality of his greeting caught her off guard until she realized that Jake was nervous. In all their years as siblings, she'd never seen him anxious about her opinion or her presence. It was a small shift, but it suggested that her proximity was already changing the dynamics between them. They gathered around the dining room table, the same table where Sarah had eaten birthday dinners and holiday meals, where she'd done homework while her parents helped Jake with projects,
and where she'd announced her MIT acceptance to parents who were too distracted to fully comprehend what she'd achieved. But tonight, Sarah wasn't the daughter who needed to fit herself into the family's existing patterns. She was a guest who'd been invited to participate. "These tamales are incredible, Mom," Sarah said after her first bite, and she meant it. Elena had always been an exceptional cook, though she had rarely taken the time to properly appreciate her mother's skill during her teenage years, when she'd been more focused on escaping to college than savoring family meals. "I used Abuela Garmen's recipe," Elena said, her face brightening at the compliment. "She always said the secret was letting the masa rest for at least 2 hours. I remember helping her make these when I was little. She used to let me spread the masa while she told me stories about growing up in Mexico."
You remember that? Elena's voice carried genuine surprise. Of course I remember. Abuela Carmen was one of my favorite people. Sarah took another bite, tasting not just the perfectly seasoned pork and peppers, but the memory of standing on a step stool next to her grandmother, learning to cook with the kind of patient attention that Carmen had always given her. Roberto cleared his throat, a sound Sarah recognized as his signal that he was about to address something important. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what your mother told me about your conversation the other day." "Dad," Sarah began, but Roberto held up a hand. "Let me say this, mija. I've been thinking about it for 40 years, actually, but I've never had the words." He set down his fork and looked directly at Sarah. "When you were growing up, I thought I was being a good father by not worrying about you. You were so capable, so independent, so good at figuring things out on your own. I thought that meant you didn't need the same kind of attention we gave Jake." Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was the conversation she'd been both dreading and hoping for since she'd moved next door. "I realize now that I was wrong," Roberto continued. "Just because you didn't need help didn't mean you didn't want support. Just because you could take care of yourself didn't mean you deserved to be taken care of." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd spent years in therapy learning to articulate exactly what Roberto had just said, but hearing it from her father's mouth felt like a key turning in a lock she'd carried in her chest for decades. "I need you to know," Roberto said, his voice growing thick with emotion, "that your independence wasn't a gift you were born with. It was something you learned because we failed to show you that you could depend on us." Elena was crying openly now, but they were different tears than the ones Sarah had seen earlier in the week. These weren't tears of self-pity or confusion. They were tears of recognition, of finally seeing clearly something that had been in front of them for years. "I don't know how to fix the past," Roberto continued, "but I want you to know that I see it now. I see what we did, and I see what it cost you." Sarah set down her fork, no longer able to focus on eating. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means more than you know." Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meal, finally spoke up. "I need to say something too." He looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his napkin in a way that reminded Sarah of the nervous boy he'd been during school presentations. Sarah waited, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a moment of genuine reflection. "I've always thought Mom and Dad paid more attention to me because I needed more help. And maybe that was true, but I never thought about what that meant for you, how it must have felt to be ignored because you were doing well." He paused, struggling with the words. "I never thanked you for all the times you helped me with homework, or listened to me complain about school, or gave me advice about jobs and relationships. I just took it for granted that you'd always be there when I needed something." "Jake!" "No, let me finish. I took your help for granted, and I never offered anything in return. I never asked how you were doing or what you needed or whether you were happy. I was so focused on my own problems that I never saw you as a person who might have problems too."
Sarah felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "I didn't want you to see my problems. I wanted to be the reliable older sister who had everything figured out." "But that wasn't fair to you," Jake said. "And it wasn't fair to me either, because it meant I never got to know who you really are. I know Sarah, the successful business owner, and Sarah, the problem solver, but I don't know Sarah, the person." The conversation that followed was unlike any Sarah had ever had with her family.
For the first time, they talked about her life not as a series of achievements to be cataloged, but as an experience to be understood. Elena asked about Sarah's daily routine, her friendships, her struggles with work-life balance. Roberto wanted to know about her business philosophy and her long-term goals. Jake inquired about her hobbies and whether she ever got lonely. Sarah found herself sharing details she'd never thought her family would be interested in hearing. She told them about her morning yoga practice and her weakness for true crime podcasts. She described her friendship with Priya and the other relationships that had sustained her through the challenging early years of building her company. She talked about the satisfaction she found in solving complex problems and the frustration of dealing with clients who undervalued her expertise. "I had no idea you were interested in pottery," Elena said, when Sarah mentioned the ceramics classes she'd been taking on weekend mornings. "I started taking them about 2 years ago. I needed something creative that had nothing to do with technology or business, something where I could work with my hands and not worry about profit margins or user engagement." "Do you have any pieces at your house? I'd love to see them." The question was so simple, so normal, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Jake was expressing genuine curiosity about Sarah's life, not because he needed something from her, but because he wanted to know her better. "I have a few bowls and a vase that I'm particularly proud of. You should come over sometime and I'll show you." As the evening wound down and they moved to the living room for coffee and the flan Elena had made for dessert, Sarah found herself marveling at how different the house felt when she was being seen as a complete person rather than just the responsible daughter. The same rooms that had once felt constraining now seemed warm and familiar, filled with the comfortable ease of people who were genuinely interested in each other's company. "Sarah," Elena said as they sat on the couch, where Sarah had once done homework while her parents watched Jake's soccer games on television, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Sarah nodded, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "When you bought the house next door, were you trying to punish us?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah considered it carefully. Had she been trying to punish them, or had she been trying to heal herself? "I think," Sarah said slowly, "I was trying to stop running away from the hurt. For 14 years, I've been building a life far enough away that I couldn't be disappointed by you anymore. But that also meant I couldn't be close to you. And now? Now I'm close enough that we have to figure out how to have a real relationship. Not the polite, distant thing we've been doing, but something honest and complicated, and maybe sometimes uncomfortable." Elena reached over and took Sarah's hand, and Sarah was surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "I want that too, mija. I want to know my daughter, not just the idea of her." Roberto, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Your success isn't just impressive to us, it's humbling. You built something incredible, and you did it without our help, without our encouragement, really. That makes us proud, but it also makes us ashamed. Dad,
We should have been your biggest supporters from the beginning. We should have been the ones cheering loudest at your debate tournaments and celebrating your MIT acceptance like it was the miracle it was. Instead, you had to find that support elsewhere, and that's on us." Jake nodded in agreement. "I've been thinking about this all week. You achieved something amazing, and instead of making sure you knew how proud we were, we treated it like it was just another Tuesday." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for so long that she'd forgotten it was there. This wasn't absolution. The hurt of those missed moments couldn't be erased with apologies. But it was recognition, and recognition was the foundation upon which new relationships could be built. "I don't need you to fix the past," Sarah said. "I just need you to see it clearly. And I need to know that things will be different going forward." "They will be," Elena said firmly.
I want to know about your pottery classes and your yoga practice and your true crime podcasts. I want to hear about your friendships and your business challenges and whatever else you want to share with me. And I want to help, Jake added. I know I can't contribute much to your business success, but maybe I can be a better brother. Maybe I can be someone you actually want to spend time with instead of someone who just calls when he needs advice. As Sarah walked back to her house that night, she felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation hadn't magically erased decades of family dysfunction, but it had created something they'd never had before, a foundation of honest communication and mutual recognition. Her phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "How did dinner go? Are you regretting the proximity purchase yet?" Sarah paused on her front porch, looking back at her childhood home where the lights were still on and her family was probably cleaning up from the best conversation they'd ever had. "No regrets," she typed back. "Turns out proximity can be healing if everyone's willing to do the work." She unlocked her front door and stepped into her beautiful house, her sanctuary, her declaration of independence, her gift to herself. But for the first time since she'd bought it, the house didn't feel like a fortress protecting her from her family's indifference. It felt like a bridge connecting who she'd been with who she was becoming, and who they all might become together. 3 months after the Sunday dinner that changed everything, Sarah stood in her newly completed home office, participating in a video conference with investors from Singapore while watching Jake mow her parents' lawn through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The scene perfectly captured how much had shifted in their family dynamic. Jake was helping Roberto, who was recovering from minor knee surgery, while Sarah conducted international business from the house next door. They were all still distinctly themselves, but the relationships between them had fundamentally transformed. The Singapore deal was worth $12 million, a partnership that would expand Sarah's software solutions into the Asian market. As she fielded questions about scalability and cultural adaptation, she noticed Elena appear in the backyard next door, carrying a tray of iced tea for Jake and Roberto. Her mother caught sight of Sarah through the window and gave her a small wave. Not the nervous, guilty gesture of 3 months ago, but the casual acknowledgement of a daughter who was both successful and beloved. After the call ended, Sarah walked outside to find Jake pushing the mower into her parents' garage, while Roberto was supervising from a lawn chair, his bandaged knee elevated on a cooler. "How did the Singapore meeting go?" Roberto asked, and Sarah still felt a small thrill at the fact that her father now knew enough about her business schedule to ask specific questions. "Very well. We're expanding into 3 new markets." Sarah accepted the glass of iced tea Elena offered her. "Jake, thank you for helping with the yard work. You didn't need to do that."
"Dad's been doing yard work for 68 years, Jake replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I figured it was time for me to learn. Plus, it's actually kind of therapeutic." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan in Sarah's driveway. Marcus Chen emerged from the passenger seat, followed by 2 people Sarah didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive suit, and a younger man carrying a professional camera. "Sarah," Marcus called out, approaching the fence that separated the properties. "Sorry to interrupt family time, but the reporter from Business Quarterly is here for the interview." Sarah had forgotten about the magazine profile, a feature article about successful women entrepreneurs that would appear in the publication's annual 40 Under 40 issue. The timing was awkward. She was sweaty from the heat, surrounded by her family, and definitely not prepared for a professional photo shoot. "Give me 5 minutes to change," Sarah said. But the reporter, who had introduced herself as Catherine Walsh, was already looking around with interest. "Actually, if you don't mind, I'd love to include the family component in the story. The angle we're pursuing is about successful women who've managed to maintain close family ties despite demanding careers." Sarah glanced at her parents and Jake, all of whom looked uncertain about being included in a magazine article. The old Sarah might have quickly ushered the reporters into her house to maintain the separation between her professional and personal life. But the new Sarah, the one who'd spent $2 million to force these worlds to collide, found herself curious about what might happen if she let them. "Would you be comfortable with that?" Sarah asked her family. "What would we need to do?" Elena asked, her hand automatically going to smooth her hair. "Just be yourselves," Catherine said warmly.
I'm interested in how successful women balance family relationships with their careers. Sarah's story is particularly intriguing because she chose to move closer to family after achieving success, which is the opposite of what we typically see. What followed was one of the most surreal hours of Sarah's life. The photographer positioned them around the backyard, capturing images of Sarah and her business attire standing next to Jake in his grass-stained t-shirt, of Elena serving iced tea while Sarah reviewed quarterly reports on her laptop, of Roberto and Sarah examining the architectural plans for the community center that Sarah had recently agreed to fund. The community center project had emerged from a conversation with her parents about the neighborhood's changing demographics. As young families moved away and older residents aged in place, the area lacked gathering spaces for different generations to connect. Sarah's initial donation of $500,000 had inspired the city council to approve matching funds, and the project was now moving forward with Sarah serving as the primary private investor. Tell me about the decision to move next door to your parents. That's unusual for someone at your level of success. Sarah considered the question, aware that her answer would be read by thousands of business leaders and aspiring entrepreneurs. I spent the first 14 years of my career building distance between myself and anything that felt like failure or disappointment. I thought success meant being invulnerable, independent, untouchable. And now? Now I understand that real success includes the ability to be vulnerable with the people you love. It includes the courage to risk disappointment in service of authentic relationship. Sarah glanced at her parents, who were listening intently. Moving next door wasn't about proving anything to my family. It was about proving to myself that I was strong enough to love them imperfectly and let them love me the same way. Catherine scribbled notes, clearly finding quotable material in Sarah's reflections. How has your family adjusted to having a millionaire next door?
Jake laughed before Sarah could answer. We're still figuring it out. Sarah bought a house that's worth more than all of our combined lifetime earnings, but she still comes over to borrow sugar and complain about the neighbor's dog barking. The dog does bark excessively, Roberto added, which made everyone laugh and seemed to capture exactly the kind of normal family dynamic that Catherine was hoping to document. The interview continued as they moved inside Sarah's house, with Catherine asking detailed questions about work-life balance, mentorship, and Sarah's plans for the future. Sarah found herself being more candid than she'd expected, perhaps because her family's presence made it impossible to retreat into corporate talking points. I spent years thinking that success meant never needing anyone, Sarah said as they sat in her living room, the afternoon light streaming through the windows that faced her childhood home. I built a company that could run without me, accumulated wealth that could protect me from most problems, and created a life where I was completely self-sufficient. That sounds like most entrepreneurs' dream, Catherine observed. It was empty, Sarah replied simply. Success without connection is just elaborate isolation. I had everything I thought I wanted, but I was profoundly lonely in ways I didn't even recognize until I started trying to build bridges back to the people who knew me before I became successful. After the reporters left, Sarah's family lingered in her house, sitting around the kitchen island that had become an informal gathering place over the past few months. Elena was examining the magazine's business card with the wonder of someone whose daughter was important enough to merit national media attention. I can't believe they're going to write about our family in a magazine, Elena said. What if I said something stupid? You were perfect, Mom. You were authentic, which is exactly what they were looking for. I still can't get used to this, Roberto said, gesturing around Sarah's kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry. My daughter living in a house like this, giving interviews to magazines, funding community centers? When did you become so powerful? The question was asked with wonder rather than discomfort, and Sarah realized that her parents had finally begun to grasp the full scope of what she'd accomplished. For years, they'd known she was successful without truly understanding what that meant. Now, witnessing her navigate a business interview while simultaneously being their daughter, they were seeing both versions of her as parts of the same person. I've been building this for 14 years. You just weren't close enough to see it happening.
Well, we're close enough now, Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah look at him more carefully. Actually, I wanted to talk to all of you about something, Jake continued, his tone becoming more serious. Watching Sarah over the past few months, seeing how she runs her business, how she thinks about problems, how she makes decisions, it's made me realize that I've been coasting. Sarah felt a flutter of concern. Jake, you don't need to. No, let me say this. I'm 28 years old and I've been living in my childhood bedroom, making barely enough money from streaming to cover my expenses with no real plan for the future. Jake's voice was steady but tinged with embarrassment. I told myself that I was pursuing my passion, but honestly, I was just taking the path of least resistance. Elena and Roberto exchanged glances, and I could see that this conversation had been building for a while. I've been accepted to a coding boot camp. It's a 6-month intensive program that focuses on web development and user experience design. I start in 2 weeks. Sarah felt a surge of pride and surprise. Jake, that's fantastic. What made you decide to do that? Watching you, honestly, I realized that passion without skill and skill without discipline don't add up to much. You didn't just get lucky with your success. You studied, you practiced, you made sacrifices, you took risks. He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. I've never done any of those things. I've been waiting for success to find me instead of going out and building it.
The boot camp is expensive, Roberto added, but Jake's going to pay for it himself with money he saved from streaming. And he's moving out of your old room and into an apartment near the school. Sarah looked at her brother with new respect. The decision to leave his comfortable setup at home and invest in his own education represented a level of initiative she'd never seen from him before. I was wondering, Jake said, his voice becoming hesitant, if you might be willing to be a reference for me when I start applying for jobs after the program. I know I don't have traditional experience, but I've learned a lot about digital platforms and user engagement through streaming. Of course, Sarah said immediately. And if you want to do an internship at Martinez Tech Solutions after you complete the program, we can discuss that too. Jake's face lit up. Really? You'd consider hiring me? I'd consider it, but you'd have to earn it, Sarah said firmly. No family discounts, no special treatment. If you want to work for my company, you'll need to prove that you can add value. I wouldn't want it any other way, Jake replied, and Sarah could see that he meant it. As summer turned to fall, the rhythm of life on Maple Groves Drive settled into something that felt familiar and entirely new. Sarah's morning yoga practice often coincided with Roberto's early coffee routine, and they'd developed a habit of waving to each other through their respective kitchen windows. Elena had started bringing Sarah fresh flowers from her garden twice a week, not as an apology or a peace offering, but simply because she enjoyed sharing something beautiful with her daughter. The most significant change came in the form of Sunday dinners, which had evolved from awkward family obligations into genuine celebrations of their evolving relationships. Elena would spend Saturday afternoons planning menus that included Sarah's favorite dishes, while Roberto would research current events in the technology industry so he could ask informed questions about Sarah's work. Jake, when he was home from his boot camp program, would share stories about his classmates and the projects he was working on. But the Sunday that marked 6 months since Sarah had moved next door brought an unexpected guest. Sarah was helping Elena set the table when the doorbell rang, and Elena returned to the dining room followed by a woman Sarah had never seen before. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Carmen Rodriguez. She's been asking to meet you ever since she heard about your community center project. Carmen was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was accustomed to getting things done. She shook Sarah's hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. Ms. Martinez, I run the neighborhood association, and I wanted to thank you personally for your investment in our community. But I also wanted to talk to you about something else. They sat down to dinner with Carmen as their guest, and Sarah learned that the neighborhood association had been struggling for years with issues that money alone couldn't solve. There were elderly residents who needed help with basic maintenance, but were too proud to ask for assistance. There were single mothers who couldn't afford after-school care for their children. There were teenagers who had nowhere to go after school and were beginning to get into trouble. The community center is going to help with some of these issues, Carmen explained, but what we really need is ongoing support. Not just financial, but human. We need people who are willing to get involved.
Sarah found herself thinking about her conversation with the magazine reporter, about success and connection and the kind of legacy she wanted to build. What did you have in mind? We're starting a mentorship program, Carmen said, pairing successful adults with young people who could benefit from guidance and support. We were hoping you might consider participating. Elena and Roberto exchanged glances, and Sarah could see that they'd known about this invitation in advance. The realization that her parents had been talking about her with neighbors, advocating for her involvement in community activities, felt like another small miracle in their evolving relationship. I'd be interested, Sarah said, but I want to be realistic about my availability. I travel frequently for business, and my schedule can be unpredictable. We understand, Carmen replied, but even a few hours a month would make a difference. There are kids in this neighborhood who've never met a successful businesswoman, who don't know that the kind of career you've built is possible for them. By the end of the evening, Sarah had agreed to mentor 2 high school students, a girl interested in computer science and a boy whose family was struggling financially, but who showed promise in mathematics. The commitment felt both daunting and energizing, another way of investing in the community she'd chosen to call home. As October deepened into November, Sarah found herself busier than ever, but busy in a way that felt sustainable rather than frantic. Her company continued to grow, with the Singapore expansion exceeding projections and new contracts coming in faster than her team could process them. But she'd also restructured her role to allow for more delegation, trusting her employees to handle day-to-day operations while she focused on strategic planning and major client relationships. The mentorship program was proving to be one of the most rewarding aspects of her new life. 15-year-old Sofia Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, was a quiet girl with a passion for coding, who reminded Sarah painfully of herself at that age. 17-year-old David Chen was struggling to balance part-time work with his academic responsibilities, trying to help support his family while maintaining the grades necessary for college scholarships. Sarah met with both students weekly, sometimes in her home office, sometimes at the coffee shop that had opened near the future community center site. She helped Sophia navigate the complexities of online coding courses and college application essays. She worked with David to create a budget that would allow him to reduce his work hours without compromising his family's financial stability. But perhaps more importantly, she shared her own story, the struggles of being taken seriously in male-dominated spaces, the challenges of starting a business without family connections or inherited wealth, the importance of building networks and seeking mentorship. She talked about failure and resilience, about the difference between confidence and competence, about the long view of career development. "I wish I'd had someone like you when I was your age," Sophia said during one of their sessions, looking up from the laptop where she was working on a coding project that Sarah had assigned her. "You're doing better than I was at your age," Sarah replied, honestly. "You're asking for help, you're thinking strategically about your future, and you're not trying to figure everything out alone. Those are skills I had to learn much later." The comments sparked a conversation about family dynamics, and Sarah found herself sharing carefully edited versions of her own experience growing up as the overlooked child. She talked about the importance of finding validation from multiple sources, about building relationships with people who could see and nurture your potential. "My parents think I should focus on more practical subjects," Sophia said quietly. "They want me to study nursing or teaching, something stable." Sarah recognized the familiar tension between family expectations and personal ambition. "Those are both excellent careers," she said carefully, "but they should be choices you make because they align with your interests and abilities, not because they feel safer to your parents." "How do I convince them that computer science is practical?" "You show them," Sarah replied. "You build things. You solve problems. You demonstrate the value of what you're learning. And if they still not understand, you find other people who do." It was advice she could have used 20 years earlier, and giving it now felt like a way of healing something in her own past.
The first snowfall of the season arrived in early December, blanketing Maple Grove Drive in the kind of pristine white that made everything look like a greeting card. Sarah was reviewing profit and loss statements in her home office when she saw Jake's car pull into her parents' driveway. He'd been coming home most weekends since starting the boot camp, and the visits had become something Sarah looked forward to. She watched him walk up the front steps with the confident stride of someone who was finally moving forward with purpose. The coding program was challenging him in ways that his previous pursuits hadn't, and the change in his demeanor was remarkable. He carried himself differently, still relaxed and friendly, but with an underlying sense of direction that had been missing before. 20 minutes later, Jake appeared at Sarah's door carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop down the street. "Peace offering," he said, extending one of the cups. "I wanted to talk to you about something, and I figured caffeine might help." They settled in Sarah's living room, and Jake took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking about our conversation from 6 months ago," he said, "about how different our experiences were growing up, and how I never really saw you as a person with your own struggles and needs." Sarah nodded, curious about where the conversation was heading. "I want you to know that it's changed how I think about everything. Not just our relationship, but my relationship with Mom and Dad too." Jake paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I realized that I've been letting them take care of me in ways that weren't healthy for any of us." "What do you mean?" "I mean that by staying dependent on them, financially, emotionally, practically, I was preventing all of us from growing. They couldn't see you clearly because they were so focused on managing my problems, and I couldn't develop real independence because it was easier to let them handle things for me." Sarah felt a surge of respect for her brother's insight. That's a pretty sophisticated analysis. "Well, I've had a good teacher," Jake said with a slight smile. "Watching you navigate your relationship with them over the past few months has been educational." They talked for another hour, and Sarah found herself sharing aspects of her business philosophy that she had never discussed with Jake before. She explained her approach to hiring and team building, her strategies for managing risk and uncertainty, her methods for staying innovative in a rapidly changing industry. Jake listened with the kind of focused attention that their parents had always given his problems, but he was applying it to understanding Sarah's successes. For the first time in their relationship, he was approaching her as a peer rather than as the sister who could solve his problems.
"I have a confession," Jake said as their conversation wound down. "I've been following your company's social media accounts and reading articles about you online. I wanted to understand what you'd built, not just that you'd built something successful. And I'm genuinely impressed, not just by the financial success, but by the way you talk about leadership and innovation. You think about problems differently than most people." Jake paused. "I can see why your employees respect you." The comment meant more to Sarah than Jake probably realized. Recognition from her family had always felt conditional, tied to their ability to understand and categorize her achievements. But Jake was acknowledging something deeper, her fundamental competence, her way of thinking, her leadership style. As December progressed toward the holidays, Sarah found herself busier than ever, but in the best possible way. Her company had been approached by a venture capital firm about a potential acquisition that would value Martinez tech solutions at over $100 million. The offer was flattering, but premature. Sarah wasn't ready to sell, and the company was growing too rapidly to consider an exit strategy. But the interest had prompted important conversations with her board about long-term planning and succession strategies. Sarah had built the company to be sustainable without her, but she'd never seriously considered what might happen if she decided to step back from day-to-day operations. "What would you do if you weren't running the company?" Marcus asked during one of their weekly strategy meetings. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "For 14 years, my identity has been so tied to building this business that I've never really considered what comes next." "You could teach," Marcus suggested. "You'd be good at it, and there are a lot of programs that need people with your experience." The suggestion resonated more than Sarah expected.
Her work with Sophia and David had reminded her how much she enjoyed mentoring and problem-solving in educational contexts. She found herself imagining what it might be like to design curricula for aspiring entrepreneurs, to share hard-won lessons about leadership and innovation with the next generation of business leaders. But those were considerations for the future. Right now, she had a company to run, a community center to fund, 2 students to mentor, and a family relationship to continue nurturing. It was more complicated than the solitary success she'd built over the previous decade, but it was also more fulfilling. The week before Christmas, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Elena appeared at her door, carrying a wrapped package and wearing the nervous expression that Sarah had learned to associate with her mother attempting something outside her comfort zone. "I made you something," Elena said, extending the package. "I wasn't sure if you'd like it, but I wanted to try." Inside the wrapping was a hand-knit sweater in a sophisticated charcoal gray that would coordinate perfectly with Sarah's professional wardrobe. The workmanship was exquisite. Elena had always been skilled with her hands, but more importantly, the style and color showed that her mother had been paying attention to Sarah's preferences and lifestyle. "Mom, this is beautiful," Sarah said, holding the sweater up to examine the intricate cable pattern. "When did you have time to make this?" "I've been working on it for 2 months," Elena replied, her cheeks flushing with pleasure at Sarah's obvious appreciation. "I wanted to make you something that you could actually use, something that fit with your life now instead of my idea of what your life should be." The distinction was subtle but significant, and Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. For years, her mother's gifts had reflected Elena's vision of who Sarah should be rather than who she actually was. But this sweater, practical, elegant, thoughtfully designed, showed that her mother was finally seeing her daughter clearly.
"I love it," Sarah said, and she meant it completely. "It's perfect." They hugged, and for the first time in years, the embrace felt natural and unforced. Sarah could smell her mother's familiar perfume and feel the slight tremor in Elena's hands that had become more pronounced as she aged. These were details she'd forgotten during the years when their interactions had been brief and formal, conducted mostly over video calls and holiday visits. Christmas morning brought the entire extended family to Sarah's house for the first time since she'd moved to Maple Grove Drive. Aunt Rosa had driven in from Phoenix with her husband and teenage daughter. Uncle Miguel had come from San Antonio with his wife and twin boys. Cousins who hadn't seen each other in years gathered around Sarah's dining room table, which had been extended with folding tables to accommodate everyone. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary from family complications had become the center of family celebration, and Sarah marveled at how natural it felt. She moved between kitchen and dining room with the ease of someone who belonged exactly where she was, serving food and facilitating conversations and making sure everyone felt included. "I love it," Sarah said, and she meant it completely. "It's perfect." They hugged, and for the first time in years, the embrace felt natural and unforced. Sarah could smell her mother's familiar perfume and feel the slight tremor in Elena's hands that had become more pronounced as she aged. These were details she'd forgotten during the years when their interactions had been brief and formal, conducted mostly over video calls and holiday visits. Christmas morning brought the entire extended family to Sarah's house for the first time since she'd moved to Maple Grove Drive. Aunt Rosa had driven in from Phoenix with her husband and teenage daughter. Uncle Miguel had come from San Antonio with his wife and twin boys. Cousins who hadn't seen each other in years gathered around Sarah's dining room table, which had been extended with folding tables to accommodate everyone. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary from family complications had become the center of family celebration, and Sarah marveled at how natural it felt. She moved between kitchen and dining room with the ease of someone who belonged exactly where she was, serving food and facilitating conversations and making sure everyone felt included. "Sarah, this house is incredible," Rosa said, examining the custom light fixtures and architectural details. "You've done so well for yourself, mija." "Thank you, Tia Rosa. It means a lot to have everyone here." "Your mother can't stop talking about how proud she is of you," Rosa continued, lowering her voice slightly. "She says you're funding a community center and mentoring students. She lights up when she talks about your success." The observation surprised Sarah.
Elena had been expressing pride more directly in recent months, but Sarah hadn't realized that her mother was sharing that pride with extended family members. "We're all proud," Miguel added, joining their conversation. "You've built something remarkable, and you've done it with integrity. That matters more than the money." After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room for gift exchange and conversation, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been successful but isolated, wealthy but lonely, accomplished but somehow incomplete. The decision to buy the house next door seemed like a dramatic gesture born of frustration and hurt. But sitting in her living room, surrounded by family members who were finally seeing her as a complete person, rather than just a successful abstraction, Sarah realized that the purchase had less about revenge and more about hope. She'd invested $2 million in the possibility that proximity could create understanding, that presence could generate love, that success shared was more meaningful than success achieved in isolation. The investment was paying dividends she'd never expected. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the main hall of the newly completed Maple Grove Community Center, watching as Sophia Martinez, now a freshman at MIT on a full scholarship, demonstrated the coding project she'd developed for her computer science course. The 17-year-old was explaining her algorithm for optimizing small business inventory management to a group of middle school students. Her confidence and expertise a testament to the mentorship program that had connected them 2 years earlier. The key insight, Sophia was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to trust her own intelligence, is that you can predict customer demand patterns by analyzing multiple data streams simultaneously. Most small businesses only look at sales history, but
When you incorporate weather data, local events, and seasonal trends, you can reduce waste by up to 30%. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride, the same feeling she experienced when her own employees presented innovative solutions to complex problems. But this pride was different, warmer, more personal, tinged with the satisfaction of having planted seeds that were now bearing fruit in someone else's life. The community center itself had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as Sarah's modest investment had attracted additional funding from state grants, corporate sponsors, and individual donors throughout the region. The final complex included not just meeting spaces and a gymnasium, but also a computer lab, a commercial-grade kitchen for culinary classes, and a small business incubator that was already home to 3 startup companies. "Sarah, you need to see this," called David Chen from across the room. Now 20 and a junior at the State University studying economics and business administration, David had become one of the community center's most effective ambassadors. He was standing near a display board covered with photos and testimonials from program participants. Sarah walked over to find a collection of success stories that read like a catalog of transformed lives. There was Maria Santos, who had started a catering business using the center's commercial kitchen and now employed 6 people from the neighborhood. There was James Washington, whose after-school tutoring program had raised standardized test scores at the local elementary school by 15%. There was Ana Rodriguez, who had launched a graphic design company from the business incubator and was already considering expansion to a second location. "Look at this one," David said, pointing to a photo of a young woman Sarah didn't recognize, Carmen Torres. She was homeless when she started coming to the center 18 months ago. Now she's completing her GED and working as an assistant in the computer lab. Sarah studied the photo, seeing in Carmen's face the same determined hope she remembered from her own teenage years. The center had become exactly what she'd envisioned, not just a building, but a catalyst for individual transformation and community connection. "Miss Martinez?" A voice behind her made Sarah turn. She found herself facing a girl of perhaps 13, all sharp elbows and serious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes? I'm Isabella Moreno. Mrs. Rodriguez said you might be willing to mentor me. I want to study engineering, but my parents think girls aren't good at math." Sarah felt her heart clench with recognition. Isabella's words could have been her own at that age, expressing the same hunger for validation and the same frustration with limiting expectations.
What kind of engineering interests you? Sarah asked, crouching down to meet Isabella at eye level. Biomedical. I want to design prosthetics that can be controlled by thought patterns. My little brother was born without his left hand, and I think technology should be able to help him. The sophistication of Isabella's ambition took my breath away. Here was a 13-year-old who had identified a complex problem and was already thinking about solutions that combined multiple disciplines. That's an incredible goal, Sarah said seriously. And you're absolutely right that technology can help your brother. The field of brain-computer interfaces is advancing rapidly. Isabella's face lit up with the joy of being taken seriously by an adult who understood her aspirations. You know about brain-computer interfaces? I know enough to know that we need brilliant young engineers like you working on these problems. I'd be honored to mentor you.
As they exchanged contact information, Sarah caught sight of Elena and Roberto across the room, standing near the center's small cafe and watching their daughter with expressions of wonder that had become familiar over the past 2 years. Her parents had attended every major milestone in the community center's development, gradually understanding that Sarah's investment wasn't just about money, it was about creating the kind of community support system that had been missing from her own childhood. "There's my successful daughter," Elena said as Sarah approached them, her voice carrying the warmth and pride that had replaced the nervous uncertainty of their early conversations. "I'm proud of what you've built here, mija," Roberto added, gesturing around the bustling community center. "This is about more than business success. This is about legacy." The word resonated with Sarah as she looked around the room filled with young people learning, adults teaching, families connecting. Legacy had once meant something abstract to her: financial security, professional recognition, industry impact. But standing in the space that she'd helped create, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the opportunities it provided, legacy felt tangible and immediate. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Presentation went great. The investors want to move forward with funding. Thanks for all your advice over the past month." Sarah smiled as she read the message. Jake's technology startup, a platform that helped small streamers monetize their content more effectively, was securing its first round of venture capital funding. He'd spent 6 months developing the business plan with Sarah's guidance, learning to think strategically about market opportunities and competitive advantages. The transformation in their relationship had been as dramatic as any other change in Sarah's life over the past 2 years. Jake had graduated from his coding boot camp with highest honors and had spent a year working for a local tech company before deciding to launch his own venture. He'd approached Sarah not as the little brother seeking rescue, but as an entrepreneur seeking mentorship from someone with relevant experience. Their weekly business dinners had become a highlight of Sarah's week, conversations that blended family affection with professional respect. Jake had proven to be innovative and disciplined in ways that had surprised everyone, including himself. More importantly, he'd learned to see Sarah as a complete person: successful businesswoman, loving daughter, complex individual with her own needs and struggles. "Miss Martinez, do you have a moment?" Sarah turned to find Catherine Walsh, the reporter who had profiled her for Business Quarterly 2 years earlier. The article had generated significant attention, leading to speaking engagements, board appointments, and consulting opportunities that Sarah had carefully selected to align with her values and interests. "Catherine, what brings you to Maple Grove?" "I'm working on a follow-up piece about women entrepreneurs who've used their success to create social impact. Your community center project has been mentioned in several academic papers about innovative approaches to economic development." They talked for 20 minutes, with Catherine taking notes as Sarah described the impact of the center on local business development, educational outcomes, and community cohesion. The conversation reminded Sarah of how much her definition of success had evolved since their first interview. 2 years ago, you talked about learning to be vulnerable with the people you love. How has that philosophy influenced your approach to business? "It's made me a better leader," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Vulnerability requires emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence is essential for building trust with employees, clients, and partners. The skills I learned in rebuilding my family relationships have made me more effective in every aspect of my professional life." As the community center event wound down, Sarah found herself standing in the parking lot with her parents, watching families load sleeping children into cars and teenagers make plans to meet at the center again tomorrow. The scene felt like validation of everything she'd hoped to accomplish when she'd made the impulsive decision to buy the house next door. "Sarah," Elena said softly, "I need to tell you something." Sarah looked at her mother, noting the serious expression that suggested an important conversation was coming. "2 years ago, when you moved next door, I thought you were trying to punish us for not being the parents you deserved," Elena continued. "I was hurt and confused and maybe a little scared of what you might do with all that money and anger. Mom, let me finish, mija. I've been watching you for 2 years now, seeing how you work and how you love and how you think about the world. And I realized that you weren't trying to punish us at all. You were trying to save us." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. Save you from what? From missing the rest of your life, from making the same mistakes with your future that we made with your past. Elena's voice was thick with emotion. "You forced us to see you clearly, and in doing that, you gave us the chance to love you better." Roberto nodded in agreement. "You could have written us off completely. You could have used your success to prove that you didn't need us. Instead, you invested in the possibility that we could become the family you deserved." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. "I invested in the possibility that we could become the family we all deserved." They stood together in the parking lot as the last cars departed. 3 people who had learned to love each other with honesty and intention rather than assumption and obligation. The community center glowed with warm light behind them, a physical manifestation of what could happen when success was shared rather than hoarded, when proximity was chosen rather than endured. 5 years later, the notification came through Sarah's phone at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning as she was reviewing quarterly projections in her home office. MIT had officially announced that the Martinez Patel Institute for Inclusive Technology would open its doors the following fall, funded by a $50 million gift from Sarah Martinez and Dr. Priya Patel. Sarah set down her phone and looked out the window at her parents' house, where Elena was hanging laundry on the line she'd refused to replace despite Roberto's continued offers to buy a modern dryer. Some things never changed, and Sarah had learned to find comfort in the constants as well as the transformations. The Institute represented the culmination of 3 years of planning and fundraising, a research center focused on developing technology solutions for underserved communities. Sarah and Priya had conceived the project during one of their monthly video calls, recognizing that their combined expertise in technology and medicine could address problems that traditional research institutions often overlooked. "Congratulations, boss," Marcus said as he arrived for their morning strategy meeting. MIT called it a transformative investment in the future of ethical technology development. "Pretty impressive for a girl from Maple Grove Drive." Sarah laughed at the characterization. "A girl from Maple Grove Drive who happened to build a company worth $200 million. Details," Marcus replied with a grin.
The success of Martinez Tech Solutions had exceeded everyone's projections, including Sarah's own. The company's software platforms were now used by over 50,000 businesses across 4 continents, and the passive income from licensing deals provided the financial freedom that had made the Institute possible. But perhaps more importantly, the company had become a model for ethical business practices and employee development. Sarah had implemented profit-sharing programs, comprehensive mental health benefits, and professional development opportunities that other companies were beginning to emulate. The business press had started referring to the Martinez method of leadership, characterized by transparency, collaboration, and long-term thinking. "Speaking of details," Marcus continued, "Jake wants to know if you're available for dinner tonight. He has news about the wedding planning." Jake's engagement to his coding boot camp classmate, Maria Santos, had been announced 3 months earlier at a family barbecue in Sarah's backyard. The couple had met during their final project presentation and had bonded over their shared experience of career transitions and their mutual appreciation for Sarah's mentorship. "Tell him yes, but I need to be done by 8. I'm video calling with Isabella about her MIT application." Isabella Moreno, now 18 and about to graduate as valedictorian of her high school class,
had been accepted to MIT's biomedical engineering program with a full scholarship. Her prosthetics research had already attracted attention from medical device companies, and she'd spent the summer interning at Sarah's company to learn about the business aspects of technology development. The mentorship program had expanded beyond Sarah's individual efforts to become a cornerstone of the community center's offerings. Sophia Martinez, now a senior at MIT, was returning to Maple Grove after graduation to help launch a technology incubator specifically for women and minority entrepreneurs. David Chen had completed his MBA and was working as the community center's director of economic development. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways that Sarah couldn't have predicted when she'd first agreed to mentor 2 high school students. Former mentees were becoming mentors themselves, creating a network of support and opportunity that extended far beyond the boundaries of Maple Grove Drive. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her review of the day's schedule. The caller ID showed Elena's name, unusual for a Tuesday morning when her mother was typically focused on household routines. "Mija, are you busy?" Elena's voice carried an excitement that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "Never too busy for you, Mom. What's going on?" "I just got off the phone with Channel 7. They want to do a story about the community center for their evening news program, and they specifically asked to interview our family about how your success has impacted the neighborhood." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and amazement at how far their relationship had traveled. 5 years earlier, Elena had been uncomfortable acknowledging Sarah's achievements even in private conversations. Now she was actively participating in media coverage that celebrated her daughter's impact on their community. "That sounds wonderful, Mom. When do they want to film?" "This afternoon, if possible. They want to capture the after-school programs in action, and they'd like to interview us about what it's been like having you living next door." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Elena sharing details about the reporter's questions and her own nervous excitement about appearing on television. Sarah found herself marveling at the confidence her mother had developed over the past 5 years, the way Elena now spoke about their family story as something worth sharing rather than something to be hidden or minimized.
After ending the call, Sarah walked out onto her back deck and looked across the fence at her childhood home. The blue neon lights had long since been replaced with warm LED fixtures that Jake had installed before moving to his own apartment. The bedroom that had once been a source of such pain was now Roberto's hobby room, filled with woodworking tools and the furniture he'd begun crafting as a retirement project. The physical spaces had been transformed, but more importantly, the emotional landscape had been completely redrawn. What had once been a site of exclusion and resentment had become a place of inclusion and mutual support. The proximity that Sarah had purchased for $2 million had generated returns that couldn't be measured in any currency. Her laptop chimed with an incoming video call from Dr. Priya Patel, and Sarah settled back into her home office to discuss the final details of the Institute's launch. Through the window, she could see Elena in the backyard, tending to the garden that had become a source of fresh flowers for both households. "You look happy," Priya observed as Sarah's face appeared on the screen. "I am happy," Sarah replied, and she meant it completely. "I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do, with the people I want to be doing it with." It was a simple statement, but it represented something that had once seemed impossible, a life that integrated professional success with personal fulfillment, individual achievement with community impact, ambitious goals with loving relationships. 10 years later, the Forbes article calling Sarah Martinez the tech executive who redefined success was published on the same day that Isabella Moreno announced her breakthrough in thought-controlled prosthetics research. Sarah read both pieces from her office at the Martinez Patel Institute, where she now spent 3 days a week as director of community engagement while maintaining her role as chairman of Martinez Tech Solutions. At 42, Sarah had achieved a level of success that felt both substantial and sustainable. Her company continued to thrive under Marcus's leadership as CEO, while her institute work allowed her to focus on the intersection of technology and social justice that had become her primary passion. She had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, had been appointed to the boards of 3 major foundations, and had been featured on magazine covers as an example of principled leadership. But the achievement that meant the most to her was visible through her office window. Elena Martinez, now 73, was leading a group of community center volunteers in setting up for the annual Maple Grove Technology Fair. Her mother moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had found purpose in supporting other people's dreams, and she wore a t-shirt that read, "Martinez Institute Volunteer Coordinator," with obvious pride. The technology fair had grown from a small community center event into a regional showcase that attracted participants from across 3 states. This year's keynote speaker would be Isabella Moreno, whose prosthetics company had just received FDA approval for its revolutionary brain-computer interface devices. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Maria and I are bringing the kids over for Sunday dinner. Mom wants to know if you're planning to join us or if you have another very important business meeting to attend." Sarah smiled at the gentle teasing. Jake and Maria's twins, Elena and Roberto Jr., were now 5 years old and had become the center of family gatherings. Sarah's role as their aunt had taught her new dimensions of love and responsibility, while their presence had added joy and chaos to the Sunday dinners that remained a cornerstone of family life. Sarah replied to Jake's text. "Wouldn't miss it. Tell Mom I'm bringing dessert from that bakery she likes." She walked to her window and watched Elena directing the setup with the same meticulous care she'd once reserved for Jake's school projects. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her mother had become her biggest advocate, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her daughter's achievements and community impact.
Roberto appeared in the yard, carrying folding chairs with movements that had grown more careful over the years, but remained determined. At 75, he split his time between woodworking and volunteering at the Institute's workshop programs, teaching practical skills to young entrepreneurs. A knock at her door interrupted Sarah's observations. Isabella Marino stood in the hallway, now 28 and impossibly accomplished, but still carrying the wire-rimmed glasses and serious expression that had characterized her at 13. "Ready for tomorrow's presentation?" Sarah asked. "Nervous, but excited. I keep thinking about that scared 13-year-old who thought girls couldn't be good at math." Isabella smiled. "Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You always had it. You just needed someone to recognize it." As Isabella left to continue her preparation, Sarah reflected on the decade that had transformed not just her family relationships, but her understanding of success itself. The $2 million house had been an investment in possibility. The possibility that proximity could create understanding, that wealth could generate connection, that success shared was exponentially more meaningful than success achieved in isolation. Her phone chimed with a reminder about Sunday dinner preparation. Sarah gathered her things, locked her office, and walked the 20 steps between her professional life and her personal one. A distance that had once felt insurmountable, but now felt like coming home. Some investments, she reflected, paid dividends that couldn't be calculated, but could be felt in every interaction, every shared meal, every moment of genuine connection.